Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The name of this program is titled World Watchers. It's broadcast number 699, April the 29th, 1985. Another month gone by just too fast. The President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, is a sandwich. He's a sausage between two pieces of bread being squeezed at both ends. One is Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger representing the Fourth Reich. The other is Richard von Weizsäcker and Helmut Kohl representing the Fourth Reich. Germany in America, Germany in Germany, the President of the United States in between, and the relish on the bun is, of course, Richard Nixon with his long contacts to the Germans in America and bringing them to America and in Germany also. Now, last week after the broadcast in the news, following, it was like Tuesday or Wednesday, was an article about Helmut Kohl, who said that he had reassured Ronald Reagan that he would not back out of the demand that he visit BITBURG, and that there was no way to change that itinerary. There would be a way, but there's no way, and it's very important to recognize that there is no way they're going to change that commitment. Now, a Kohl advisor added, and this was in the San Francisco Chronicle, it was April 23rd, in quotes, "If one tries to act symbolically, one has to choose the symbols carefully. If one tries to act symbolically, one has to choose the symbols carefully," end quote. Well, the symbols of this particular BITBURG piece of geography was the staging area for the Battle of the Bulge. It was the area where the Germans, the hierarchy of the SS, would meet the United States and be welcomed open-armed, and they would decide already at that moment, it had been decided that their real project was to take on the Soviet Union. It involved a cast of characters that I've been talking about for the past years. Prince Bernhard of the SS, who worked for I.G. Farben and married Queen Juliana in Holland. Henry Kissinger, the advisor to all media networks at the present time and former Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, the roving ambassador for the Germans. William Casey, the CIA director, and Fritz Kramer. These names are so familiar to some of you, I'm going to go on now. Senator Howard Metzenbaum urged Chancellor Kohl to back down on the demand of our President of the United States with a quote, "Please take our president off the hook." And Helmut Kohl said no. Another quotation in the newspaper was, "I don't think the President of the United States should go to a German cemetery to honor German soldiers who died killing American soldiers in the service of the greatest tyrant of our time, Adolf Hitler." That was from Senator Cranston. He said there are graves of SS troops in the cemetery that make an unsavory act intolerable. At one point, Cranston said, "Are Germany's ties to the United States so weak and to the West so weak, then so tenuous and so insecure and uncertain that Germany's price for reassurance is the humiliation of our president? What they don't understand, the news media and Senator Cranston and Senator Metzenbaum and these well-meaning people, is that their relationship, Germany and Ronald Reagan's, is so secure that they don't care who screams and yells, they're going to meet anyway." Now, the teams have lined up a lot of people in the news media saying go, and a lot more saying don't go than go. I want to run down a few of those with you because I mentioned last week the letter that I sent out, and during the past week I sent out more letters. And instead of sending to members of our Congress, who so far have been ineffectual in most things that they bumble through, I sent them to the foreign press. I'm not going to read all the newspapers I sent them to at this time, but I sent to the Frankfurter paper, in the German paper in Frankfurt, Germany. I sent one to the German General News Service. The reason I'm citing these for you is I think it had some effect, and I'll tell you why. I sent it to Il Tempo in Rome. I sent the letters to Izvestia in Moscow and to La Libre in Belgium, all the major newspapers of the foreign news services that I had time and postage stamps to mail out. La Suisse in Geneva, Le Soir in Brussels, Le Monde in Paris, the London Daily Express, the London Guardian, the London Observer, the London Sunday Times, Magyar in Budapest. I sent it to TASS in the Soviet Union, and another one in Zurich, Switzerland, and several of them in Germany, newspapers explaining why Ronald Reagan, it was really asking him not to go until we see Fritz Kramer, but the letter was certainly self-explanatory, and many of you have a copy, and those of that you don't, I will be sending it to you. I just have been busy sending it to these public officials. Now, Robert E. Hunter, Director of European Studies from Georgetown Center, said he didn't think Ronald Reagan should go. Ronald Reagan is making it a Jewish issue. Didn't I help get the Jews out of Ethiopia for Israel? Big deal. Don't I help get the Jews out of the Soviet Union? Sure, you do the Wallenberg movie, you do the USSR, because everything is geared anti-Soviet, and the Jews have been used. This Save the Soviet Jews has been a front for continuous anti-Semitism in stirring up the Soviet Union and making it a Jewish issue. Governor Dumakian in California, the heir apparent, if Kissinger doesn't squeeze him out, one of them of the Republican Party, has argued with the president publicly, don't go. Reverend Jerry Falwell, one of the biggest supporters and a consultant before the elections took place, said don't go. Reverend Billy Graham said this week, don't go. Before I sent the letter, and it was on national television, I had no influence, the Senate leader of his own particular party, Robert Dole, said don't go. Again, I want to repeat, Ronald Reagan and the Germans want to make this a Jew problem, a Jewish issue, to stir up more anti-Semitism that is always there. None of these people, except several that I'll mention here, who've played their game all along, happen to be Jewish. Now, I'm going to read you, and you probably read the articles this morning, of Mr. Rommell, the son of the Desert Fox, who now has a position in Germany. He was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's son. Manfred Rommell is the father, was the Field Marshal of World War II. He's the mayor of Stuttgart, and he said to Helmut Kohl, cancel. And another one who interestingly said cancel was Mr. Strauss, the well-known Nazi in Germany, the most outspoken chairman. He's the chairman of the Social Union Party of the Bavarian arm of Kohl's Christian Democrats. He's a rival of Kohl's. He's farther right than Kohl. Now, these aren't Jew boys. These are farther right than Helmut Kohl that are saying, don't go to BITBURG. And I think that my letter to the German press, Swiss press, to Hungary, Belgium, Russia, Britain, France, and Italy, over 100 letters just to the media alone, had some influence, and I'll tell you why, on why Rommel and Strauss say don't go. Also, National Security Advisor Robert C. McFarlane, otherwise his top aide, one of the two, sent a message to Helmut Kohl, don't go to that cemetery. Now, under McFarlane is Sven Kramer, the liaison of the National Security to Ronald Reagan. I'm talking about his father now in these letters with Henry Kissinger. Is he German? Is he the mole from Germany in our Pentagon all this time in intelligence? McFarlane said don't go. He also has Mr. Dobriansky's daughter working with him, Paula Dobriansky. Lev Dobriansky is the ambassador to the Bahamas for Ronald Reagan, and I will be doing more, hopefully this week, and if not, certainly next week, on the links of Ronald Reagan and Lev Dobriansky to the Waffen SS and the responsibility of bringing him to this country earlier in the 50s and now trying to stop the deployment of Nazi war criminals around the world and to stop the investigation of the Office of Special Investigators in Washington, D.C. McFarlane, the boss of Sven Kramer, and Paula Dobriansky has said, don't go. The symbolism, as I say, as they said it, and I'm quoting again, is very important. What is the symbolism of BITBURG? The symbolism is that the United States President, speaking for Americans, forgives the Waffen SS. The symbolism is that the United States President and the Americans and the veterans living or the others in this country will forget the bulge. You get help in forgetting the bulge because many times I refer to the congressional hearings on the Dachau trials. There were the Nuremberg trials and the Dachau trials, and do you know there are not entire books on the defendants of the Dachau trial? Why? Because they were to be the builders, the SS, the choice elite were separated. The bankers were released by John J. McCloy, and the multinational weapons makers were released from the Nuremberg group, and the Dachau group were the SS, the Waffen SS. that are making tomorrow's Waffen possible, the Waffen SS. So the message of eliminating Fritz Kramer's name in every history after the war, after 1948, after he's sitting in that docket, he is nowhere in sight. The message is that the Malmedy didn't occur, the Ardennes didn't occur, the trial at Dachau didn't occur, and now we're going to this graveside. Now, Ronald Reagan is taking advice, at least in the press, from Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, the latest, and we'll go into that. Why do you think that he's in the trouble he's in right now? He misread, with the same advisors of Watergate, of Bay of Pigs, of Vietnam, he misread, as the others had, the state of mind, for example, in Cuba, when the people were behind Fidel Castro, and we thought if Americans invaded, the arms would be waving, welcome, welcome, and the Bay of Pigs would be a success. They misread the minds of the Cubans. It's the 10th anniversary since Vietnam, and you see discussions and interviews, and the main point about Vietnam was that we misread the minds of the Vietnamese people. There's some very good person, I think his name is Mr. Cleveland, on Meet the Press yesterday with Marvin Cal, saying that we didn't study history, we didn't know history, and we didn't know about the French there, and what we did was to come in and take from the French, and it wasn't the Chinese that were a threat at all, and he was bemoaning the fact that history was not considered or taught, and that is the purpose of my broadcast, of my 14 years with you, to share with you, is to lay the groundwork of the history where we move. And he did bring up the fact, a Vietnam veteran 10 years later. Well, we misread that. That's Mr. Fritz Kramer in the Pentagon's, the plans officer, with Henry Kissinger behind all of these. We misread Vietnam. We misread Iran and giving the savak to the Shah and the excesses of the cruelty and the cutting off hands and legs and the torture. We misread Chile. It will probably go Marxist soon because Pinochet can't hold on forever. We've misread South Africa because even though there was an embargo, the CIA and the United States government have been sending oil and weapons and anything that South Africa wanted. So the same people behind all of that thought that after 40 years that the Americans would not remember anything about a little battle at the Battle of the Bulge. The symbolism is there for them. They know what's going on, but they didn't think people would care or feel that much. And as much as I criticize Simon Wiesenthal for some of the people he works with and for, and the compromises he made, he has done a monumental job of accumulating the facts and information, and you have to give him credit for that. And the memories have not faded away of any person alive at that time. Ronald Reagan wants to think that all of us have Alzheimer's disease, that we can't think, we can't remember. Well, that's too bad. We misread it. So while 10 years after Vietnam is being analyzed and dissected on every channel of the news media for this past weekend and currently this week, the very people that made the horrors of Vietnam, Henry Kissinger, and coming in after LBJ with Richard Nixon, with the secret Cambodia bombings and so forth. While we're talking about that on one channel, Nixon and Kissinger are telling the president to make this other mistake. Well, as it turns out, I think it's great that he's going to BITBURG because it makes all of my work much more understandable to you. Any of you that listen to the past broadcasts or continue listening in the future, you'll understand what I'm saying. Now, the Morning Chronicle, the San Francisco Chronicle, and most of your newspapers from the Washington Post, Nixon, Kissinger, back Reagan on BITBURG visit. Isn't that wonderful? And it says that Reagan will not bow to protests from groups representing the Jews or the veterans. Now, Jews and veterans are not important. Veterans fight the war, and if they're dead, they can't scream. And he singles it down, even though these top officials who are not Jews and who are not veterans, for whatever reason, and they have their reasons, are saying, change it, don't go. And I know what they are afraid of. It's identical to Watergate, when I broke the Watergate story with why was Martha Mitchell kidnapped. What they don't want is what Mae Brussell set out. I take credit for calling Bernard Fensterwald, even though he's a CIA rat, the day the men were arrested at Watergate, and saying, hey, those are the fellows that killed Kennedy. I did it, and 7 months later, Fensterwald represented James McCord, and the story started to unfold. But the point is this: if I hadn't moved swiftly and sent those letters, I don't think that these people in Europe, the far-right conservatives who have the most to lose by the exposure of Fritz Kramer, those people want this to happen. Now, Henry Kissinger has to have it happen because his mentor and boss, Fritz Kramer, is co-partner with Daniel Graham of Star Wars, and Helmut Kohl, as I mentioned a few weeks ago and we'll keep repeating, brings in the Star Wars story. The newspaper goes on, the San Francisco Chronicle, tells about the importance of the relationships with West Germany. Henry Kissinger said the visit has to go because of the importance of West Germany. The Senate vote didn't matter. The House of Representatives doesn't matter. And I ask you one more time, loud and clearly, is Henry Kissinger an American or a German? He was at the Battle of the Bulge. He has no hatred for Germans. He loves them. He works with them. He has no hatred and no anxiety about sitting on a hayloft while all this blood and gore was going on. He has the same mind state that Mark Lane had and Charles Gary down at Jonestown. One was shaving and one was eating his own cough drops while 900 people were dropping dead on the compound a few feet away. These people are ruthless, and Henry Kissinger is talking about West Germany. Since when are our ties with West Germany not secure? Do they really depend on a wreath, on a piece of geography called BITBURG? Do our relationships, our economic policies, our trade, our weapons, our space secrets, since when does all of that, after all the money and debt we gave to them and went $100 billion in debt with Vietnam War, using people from the Waffen SS, teaching our special forces how to slice and kill, since when does the relationship of Germany depend on this little piece of ground? Now, the president said he will spend 10 to 15 minutes with the Waffen SS graves and even longer, maybe an hour, at Bergen-Belsen. Well, 47 Waffen SS is 15 minutes, and 8 million representing the Belsen symbolism is something else. There were 1 million Waffen SS, and there's only 47 in that grave. So there should be more time spent, because it wasn't just 6 million Jews that died in World War II or in the camps. So why not give it the proportion of minutes if it's 47 versus 8 million, 6 million Jews, and maybe 2 million political people that were carted off and from various countries who were anti-Nazi that were spent there. The logic is totally out. Then Richard Nixon said the credibility of future negotiations with the Germans is at stake. He's been wrong about every country he touched. He's been wrong about everything he affected. And while I have a lot of news here, I could go for a 5-hour session with you on the Battle of the Bulge. I'm taking this very slowly because I want you to think it out loud and clear in context of what I've said before. Then coming into the act, as I said, is Mr. Franz Joseph Strauss, the Bavarian minister, who says the preparations were unclever, in quotes. The results are embarrassing. The conservative Christian Democratic politician said, instead of Bitburg, go to the tomb of the unknown soldier in Munich. Strauss said that if the cemetery stop was removed without a substitute, there would be bitterness. But if he goes to a substitute, he should go there. And again, quoting Mr. Rommell, he doesn't think the President of the United States should be there. And the editorials in Germany are stepping up. The staunch pro-government Bild Zeitung said, the bitter controversy has made the planned gesture of reconciliation impossible. Translated, it means, if you go there, the exposés of us and our ass in the fire will keep going, and they are not stupid. They know exactly what is going to come down. Now, speaking of Mr. Strauss, in the book on the murder of Embassy Row of Orlando Letelier, the Chilean who was in Washington, D.C., who was murdered with Ronnie Moffat, I just want to read you two paragraphs from different pages from that book, pertinent to where Mr. Strauss stands and George Bush, who was director of the CIA when they were killed. This is by John Dingell, D-I-N-G, not L, and Saul Landau. In late summer of 1975, Mr. Contreras, who was working with Michael Townley and the people who were to kill Orlando Letelier, organized their Latin American secret police and intelligence service into a cooperative anti-exile strike force to get and kill people overseas that were talking about Mr. Pinochet. General Vernon Walters, deputy director of the CIA, met with Contreras at the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Walters is now currently to be our ambassador to the United Nations. Walters was responsible for the CIA's liaison operations with foreign intelligence agencies and oversaw the CIA's organization and training assistance to DINA. That is the terrible police, similar to the SOVAC in Chile, the murderous DINA. As a matter of fact, a representative of the Chilean government just said last week that they wish they had murdered everybody in the stadium they rounded up instead of letting any of them out. Now, the second point on quoting this murder on Embassy Row is this. Late in September, Michael Townley, that's the American, and Callejas, C-A-L-L-E-J-A-S, and Paz, P-A-Z, loaded their rented car. This is before they came to the United States for the Letelier-Moffat murders. They received new orders from Contreras. They stopped in Munich, where Dina had cultivated contacts with former Nazi sympathizers associated with the Christian Union leader Franz Joseph Strauss. From there, they went to Italy and Rome, then to Washington and the United States, where Letelier and Moffat were murdered. So George Bush was the CIA director when that murder took place. Mr. Strauss, the Nazi, is the person today who is saying, please don't go to BITBURG. It's going to open up events that we don't want to get into. And that must tell you a little bit about the network of our ambassador to the United Nations now, Mr. Strauss, the Nazi, George Bush, the vice president, and the relationship to Strauss and Rommell speaking up against the BITBURG trip. And I want to get to the Rommell story immediately. Incidentally, the Washington Times, the Reverend Moon paper, had an article April the 12th, one of the first, just when this controversy was breaking open. Large letters, the president is to honor German war dead. This is the Washington Times, April the 12th. And in that same newspaper, right next to that, is a full half page of Lee Harvey Oswald in the basement of the Dallas Police Department and Jack Ruby standing there shooting him. And then there's a drawing with a sketch around there that Mr. O'Leary, who works for Washington Times, was 3 feet from where, if 3 feet, maybe 2, from where Lee Harvey Oswald was killed. And Oswald's death, of course, cut off the information on the Nazi connections to the murder of John Kennedy. And Reverend Moon, who owns this newspaper, his gang, are linked to, closely associated with John Singlaub, the World Anti-Communist League. They're part and parcel of it, and use the Waffen SS as members of the World Anti-Communist League. And I'll get into that, if not today, some more tomorrow. Also, the new editor of the Washington Times, Mr. Deborsgrave, who I speak about often, again repeats a 1/4 page advertisement wanting $1 million to find Joseph Mengele. Now, the Reverend Moon paper and Deborsgrave asking for $1 million is identical to Mark Lane and Dick Gregory and Larry Flint running ads in the LA Free Press when it first came out, and later reissuing it on the anniversary of Kennedy's death, when instead of publishing and pushing the JFK Nazi story, which Flint wanted to do right away, they used me to write that story. Then instead of advertising it or publishing it, they started pushing and republishing again the LA Free Press to give Mark Lane and Dick Gregory and the people at Flint's the information, if anyone had, on John Kennedy's assassination. So the same time that there's an article, the president is to honor the war dead, I want to go in to what is the symbolism when KOHL's aide says if one tries to act symbolically, one chooses the symbols carefully. The cast of characters in this BITBURG story will be going on, and I will update you with them and break them down chronologically because individually they're important, but in the order that it's breaking is even more important. Now, Bill Graham, the music promoter from San Francisco, spent $11,000 last week on 2 hours' notice. It was in the San Francisco Chronicle and San Francisco Examiner, asking the president not to go to BITBURG, and if he didn't back down by 11 or 12 o'clock in the morning or noon, he would have a rally in San Francisco, and several thousand people attended, even on a few-hour notice. Don't go to BITBURG. Well, Bill Graham's mother died in a concentration camp. His sister died in a concentration camp. And I immediately called their office because I thought maybe they would have a protest on the weekend on Saturday, and I would have gone up there. But it was on 1 hour's notice. Now, all the years I've been on the air in San Francisco Bay Area, all the articles I've published, and he knows Paul Krasner, on the Nazi connections to Richard Nixon in 1972, the Nazi connections of the SLA certainly saturated the Bay Area with that when that story was breaking. On Nazis in America, there are links to Nazis in Germany. These people have sat around, many of them, all but you, my loyal listeners and subscribers to the tapes, have actually sat on their butts and have not come out of the closet. And now I'm asking them, all of them, or people you know who don't like fascism, get out of the closet now and expose this whole network and how it came down. We don't have to find a new cure for pneumonia. We already have penicillin. You don't need a new cure for polio. You have the Salk vaccine. I've done 21 years' work on this fascism. If there were people that got together, or even if Bill Graham had a concert, he could raise, imagine $11,000 for a 2-hour moment of running this story in the paper. If he ran a concert, he could raise a few $100,000, if not $1 million, and put it into some kind of a fund to get these tapes and printed material to people around the world, because now they're ready. They may not have received it before, but I actually believe that they can't help but get the message now. Remember that article in the San Jose Mercury a few years ago? It was written March 28th, 1982. It was an interview about Mae Brussell, and it was sort of the person who wrote it did a little tongue-in-cheek. I thought she was just too cute, again, for a little Jewish girl to be writing something. So it wasn't silly, but it wasn't really serious. Jill Wolfson. But on the top, she had, in Cal Today, the magazine section, remember, Hitler is alive. And I said that Ronald Reagan is a front man for the forces of evil. That's Ronald Reagan, the sandwich between the two forces of evil. She did carry it in the magazine section, and I went on and explained his relationship to these very evil people who do want World War III and want the Waffen-SS to live. Now, the Central Council of Jews in Germany just last week, not 14 years ago and not 40 years ago, protested to Chancellor Helmut Kohl over the appointment of Walter Florian, Florian, to a high post in the West German government. Florian, 62, was named State Secretary of the West German Ministry in charge of food and agriculture. He joined the Waffen-SS in 1941, and the people living in Germany who recognized who he was were disappointed, and they said, isn't there any political post available to be filled with people who are not involved with Nazi organizations? Now, the sickness of the Ronald Reagan story and the BITBURG story was his first excuse, worming out of it. Mr. Sandwich Reagan was that nobody in Germany over the age of 50, again, had a memory of what was going on. Well, there are some people who have memories going on, specifically involved with BITBURG. Here's a story, April 26, 1985. Germans send extra police for the SS reunion. Another story, April 20th. Nazi SS veterans will hold their reunion. This is at the same time when Ronald Reagan is arriving in Europe and while he's there. And another San Francisco Chronicle story, former SS troops to reconvene in Europe. Now, 4 groups are having their reunions, and you'll be reading about it. They're supposed to be dead. Ronald Reagan says they have no memory or they're dead. But the members meeting, one is the Death's Head. I mentioned briefly that the other day, I believe. The members of the SS Death's Head Division, there are over 250 veterans who will have their reunion this week. The other is the 1st Panzer Division. They'll meet May the 11th and 12th. The Death's Head meeting May 2nd to the 5th. 1st Panzer led the Ardennes offensive in the BITBURG area, the staging area. Reagan will be visiting the staging area. Do you get your symbols clearly? They talk, Mr. Kohl, you have to choose your symbols carefully. The SS Leibstandarte, Adolf Hitler's elite group that aren't much different and part of the Death's Head, they will be meeting at the same time, May 11th to 12th, and the Hitler Youth, the children of the SS, who are not quite grown up, but goodness knows what ages, or maybe these were the children who are now grown, who are having their reunion, who hold government positions and otherwise. This is the current SS. This isn't the past. As I say, Lev Dobriansky, and I'll detail that. I did want to do the whole program on it, but I have to put it off till next week because of the Kissinger, Nixon, and the Mr. Strauss and Mr. Rommell pushing, two saying go, and the other two saying don't go. See, the role of Kissinger all his life, he can't back down and say don't go, because he arranged this with Fritz Kramer. I know they did, and so they can't back out. They have to be Americans supporting the president. We'll take a 1-minute break and then get back onto the story of BITBURG, which we'll be doing for weeks to come, maybe for a year. I don't know. Ronald Reagan and the Waffen SS. This is Mae Brussell. It's part 2 of broadcast number 699, April the 29th, 1985. I want to just read one page or parts of a page from a book called Fascism Today that is pertinent to the BITBURG story and the meeting that's going to take place there. This is about the rat line, which is not, it describes the way the Nazis got out of Germany and down to South America and into the Middle East and South Africa to start over again. And, of course, later after this book was written, it turned out that Licio Gelli helped with the Vatican to construct the rat line for the Nazis to flee. Many people knew that for a long time. It was used for Adolf Eichmann to reach Argentina, and of course the man above Adolf Eichmann lived in California and placed his secretary from the corporation TCI with Ronald Reagan for 8 years, Helene von Damm. And if there's symbolism that's speaking today loud and clear, it's the American ambassador from Vienna being Reagan's secretary for 8 years and helping hire the administration the first 4 years, and then going back to Vienna, marrying the wealthiest man practically in Vienna at this time, well, one of the wealthiest, and our ambassador, it was a Viennese citizen, and she's now married to a Viennese citizen and makes the full cycle. America and Nazi Germany and Vienna melt, both in those areas with our ambassador and also at BITBURG with the ceremonies coming up next Sunday. Adolf Eichmann's superior in California. And then the book goes on to describe Otto Skorzeny and Hans Ulrich Rudel were so efficient they helped the SS generals, and among them a Kurt Meyer from the Panzer Division and Sepp Dietrich. Now, in this book, Fascism Today, it brings in two men from the Battle of the Bulge, Sepp Dietrich and Otto Skorzeny, who didn't end after 40 years. This isn't 40 years of peace. Sepp Dietrich was a defendant in that chair. The letter that I sent out and the photographs and talked about at the Battle of the Bulge, and Hans Ulrich Rudel and Sepp Dietrich and Skorzeny connect up to the Aryan nations up in Idaho, Reverend Butler, Richard Butler, and the California Lockheed connections, and Lieutenant Colonel Reverend Gale. They became ministers, and the Aryan Brotherhood with Keith Gilbert organizing the prison, the Nazis in the prison system when Reagan and Mies and Raymond Precunier were running it out here. So when you want to say 40 years is over, let's forget. If they all faded away, it would be different. But they all continued and worked with the Nazis in the United States with their computers ready to take over the United States today. And this book on it's called Fascism Today, tells about the way they raised their money, and under the screen of being humanitarian, identical to the Vatican and the Knights of Malta and Reverend Moon, giving humanitarian aid to the Contras with Vernon Walters and Prescott Bush and J. Peter Grace and William Simon and that gang. Under the guise of being humanitarian, this book says that they held together, and that the German government let the HIAG, which is the Hague, be formed because they were supposed to be a mutual aid society of thousands of former SS men. There were actually 1 million in it at the end of the war, under the guise of being humanitarian, of helping them reschedule themselves and get jobs after the war. They actually were able to enter the ranks of public administration as police functionaries, as magistrates, as mayors, as teachers. And this book goes on that over the years they established a well-organized SS group throughout the German government, and they extended not only in Germany, but then Otto Skorzeny and Hans Ulrich Rudel, who were entrusted with this pledge, this Thousand-Year Reich, of course, to Himmler and Hitler, went on down to South America, where they took the worst Nazis and Jew-baiters and into Madrid. And I've talked many times about the Odessa that was set up in Madrid with millions, billions of dollars of Nazi money, gold and diamonds, a large hunk out of Evita Peron's bank, but also the money that they've salted away. So identical to today, the humanitarian purposes, the Hague was kept continuously going and supported these people until they could work their way back in government. Now, I've mentioned Lev Dobriansky, and I'll continue part 2 of this subject right now, but I was working with another researcher this week who stated that it's no coincidence that Ronald Reagan is going to put a wreath at the tomb of the Waffen-SS. The Reagan administration has worked closely with the Waffen-SS and the people responsible for bringing them into the United States, the very Nazis that are being identified now, and we're trying to deport them, and some will be going to trial. Ronald Reagan's ambassador to the Bahamas is Lev Dobriansky. He's also on the board of the World Anti-Communist League with known members of the Waffen-SS, and John Siglaub, the advisor of the Pentagon, works with known members of the Waffen-SS. Our ambassador to the Bahamas is the publisher of a magazine called Ukrainian Quarterly, and in the summer of 1984, the Ukrainian Quarterly ran a feature article memorializing a particular general of the Waffen-SS. I'll spell his name so that you understand it. I'm going to have 3 names here that you may not be familiar with. He's General Pavlo Shandruk, Shandruk, of the Waffen-SS. He was the creator and leader of the Galecian division of the Waffen-SS, Galecian division, from the Upper Silesia area. When I heard this, I got out the book, The Order of the Death's Head, and I'm going to continue with Dobriansky and Siglaub, but I want to get to some other points this evening. I got out the book by Heinz Hohne, Hohne, The Order of the Death's Head, and turned to the section on the Upper Silesia area because Lev Dobriansky was saying what a great guy this Waffen-SS general was. And this is what I found in that book, page 302. All that mattered to Heinrich Himmler was the success of his operations, the figures, the amount of people, the Poles that could be liquidated. This is in the Upper Silesia region we're talking about, their particular area. He dispatched new murder squads who had the special duty under SS Udo von Warsch, Woyrsch, to liquidate the Poles and the Jews in the Katowice area. Katowice is where John Paul II lived. Auschwitz is right next to it. Again, it brings up the identical city of the Auschwitz Pope. He had Himmler's partners in the Rome manhunt and was intended to initiate a new phase of the SS policy in the eastern Upper Silesia area, the deportation immediately of 50,000 Jews from Danzig, from West Prussia, from Poznan, and Upper Silesia, put them into the interior of Poland, and then they were to strike terror and panic among the Jews of Upper Silesia and force them to move into the general direction of Krakow. And when Heydrich heard of this, and Mr. Wagner, Eduard Wagner, the deputy chief of staff, in the new secret plan, they would move to the eastern territories that were once more under the German rule and concentrate all the Jews in Poland and in due course ship them off to be killed. Heydrich instructed them to start the deportation right in the heart of Poland. A military operation regime was set up in conquered Poland with Commander-in-Chief of the East, Colonel General Gerd, G-E-R-D, von Rundstedt, R-U-N-D-S-T-E-D-T, as their head in Poland. Now, Gerd von Rundstedt also is in charge and goes with Mr. Sepp Dietrich and Fritz Kramer and Otto Skorzeny to the Battle of the Bulge after they annihilate and start their trains going and wiping out all the Jews and the political opponents in this Upper Silesia area, in the Katowice area where the current Pope is, with his Knights of Malta, William Simon, Vernon Walters, William Casey, Claire Luce. Shall we run them down? William and James Buckley, the current people in charge of our government, our United Nations, our Radio Free Europe, William Shakespeare, that Auschwitz Pope, and funding the Contras down in Central America, and so forth. Katowice was the area. The Upper Silesia was the selected place to start wiping them out. In this particular area was von Rundstedt, who then goes on to the Battle of the Bulge. Now, I got out one of my biographies on von Rundstedt, put out by Ballantine, The Illustrated History of the War, and on page 133, they have von Rundstedt inspecting the Atlantic Wall defenses as he moves to the west, with Sepp Dietrich, SS General Sepp Dietrich, behind Mr. von Rundstedt, and Field Marshal Rommell is mentioned. In November 33, he was given his cause for concern through the appointment of Field Marshal Rommell as inspector of the coastal fortifications. Now, the son of Field Marshal Rommell is saying today, in 1985, to Helmut Kohl, don't go to the BITBURG cemetery. Sepp Dietrich was released by Fritz Kramer and was a defendant in Dachau. I sent his pictures out last week and next week, and if you want to send me postage stamps, I have been spending a fortune in stamps. If you want to contribute some stamps to the cause or printing paper money, it really is costing a lot of money. I never ask for funds, but this is a very expensive project that I'm doing, sending to all these people. But Sepp Dietrich, Rommel, von Rundstedt, with the Upper Silesian group, and then on the Western Division, and the son of Rommel, is the symbolism isn't lost. They don't want the investigation to go on. Now, I'm going to read a section having to do with von Rundstedt and Sepp Dietrich and Fritz Kramer from Ladislas Farago's book, The Last Days of Patton. And I might mention that George Patton III, the son of General Patton that I'm talking about, is on the board of Western Goals, that international organization with computers to the BND, to the Galen Group in Germany, through Mr. Wigner, the member of the Luftwaffe pilot on Western Goals, the group that has been as silenced with their trial in Los Angeles that the LAPD settled with to not have the public at large know about the computers into police departments. John Singlaub on Western Goals with the late Larry McDonald of the John Birch Society, John Singlaub, the president of WACL with the Waffen SS, Edward Teller, the father of the Star Wars that has pushed Ronald Reagan since 1966 with the Star Wars, Admiral Moore, Kissinger's co-partner of the Watergate scandals, former chief of Navy, in fact, Joint Chief of Staff, George Patton, John Singlaub, Edward Teller, Admiral Moore, and more on Western Goals, pushing the German computers, the American computers, into international waters with the Nazis in Germany at the current time. That's why Larry McDonald had to go down, and I wrote about it because Western Goals is too important to this whole saga. But anyway, getting back to the father of Patton, the Patton who today says, don't go into BITBURG, and they know what will happen if we go into BITBURG. In the last, pardon me, I just took a sip of water. The Last Days of Patton, on page 132, it tells about his being with the top Nazis. There was, of course, no fraternization in quotes with any of the Germans, but there was one distinguished transient in the town where they were was Gert von Rundstedt, again from the Bulge and from the area, the Upper Silesia, and the area that is familiar to Lev Dobriansky and his particular Pavlo Shandrak. Von Rundstedt, by now the decrepit dean of Hitler's field marshals, got back into harness and led the Nazi offensive in the Ardennes offensive. And von Rundstedt was very comfortable after the war. He was welcomed by soldiers, and he lived in Bad Tolz, T-O-E-L-Z, holding his court of his own, waiting for the Americans to pay him homage. Patton at first ignored him. Then the word was sent out to General Patton to be kind to him. They said the word was received from Chef, that's the main headquarters, SHAEF, that he was to be treated by any other prisoner of war, removed to the VIP cage in Luxembourg, thus deprived Tolz of their only dignitary. But it was interesting for General Patton. The only friend he made in Bad Tolz, von Rundstedt, when he was staying there, was his stable boy who took excellent care of the horses. And these are Patton's horses and Patton's horse trips. No ordinary groom, he was Baron von Wagenheim, W-A-N-G-E-N-H-E-I-M, Germany's premier horseman, captain of the equestrian team, won the gold medal at the 1936 Olympic Games. A colonel in the SS Cavalry, he was paroled. He was paroled to serve Patton as his stable sergeant to take care of General George Patton's horses. Colonel von Wagenheim was an unreformed Nazi. He was of the opinion that even though the Americans fought the wrong enemy, it was not too late to make up the mistake. This was the official Nazi line conceived by General Alfred Jodl, J-O-D-L, again in the Battle of the Bulge, the morning after he signed the instrument of unconditional surrender of the top generals and members of the SS to General Patton to turn them over. The morning after he signed that, it didn't take long for the idea to take root. These Nazis, infatuated with the Fuhrer, based their expectation of a comeback on the inevitable split that would have to happen between the Americans and the Russians, and so from the outset, they spotted General Patton as their potential ally. Colonel von Wagenheim was not in St. Querin by accident, Querin. His mission to be Patton's groom to take care of General Patton's horses was arranged slyly by the Sicherheitsdienst, S-I-C-H-E-R, Sicherheit, H-E-I-T-S, Dienst, D-I-E-N-S-T. It's very important to remember that, arranged by the Sicherheitsdienst, which is the security officer of the Nazi Party, to supply and to spy on the pro-council and partly to stimulate his anti-Russian slant. This is General Patton and the people that would be defending them or prosecuting them. Patton rated his English-speaking, debonair, stable sergeant as a very good man, the debonair Olympic person who 1936 Olympics. And the Baron, indeed, was a delightful companion on long horse rides when General Gay was prevented from accompanying him. General Gay might have been the American control over this staunch Nazi, Baron von Wagenheim, but Gay was left home, and Wagenheim rode alone with General Patton out in the fields, just as Ronald Reagan gets on his horses and goes off in secrecy. That's where I'm sure the prime meetings are held, where there's no bugs, unless they're tied to the horse's tail and back. In spite of the vast differences in their rank and status, General Patton and his groom became friends. This is General Patton speaking. I've never had any animus against the professional soldier who fought against me. That's what they were hired to do. And that was the meeting place after the Battle of the Bulge with the top people. Again, I think I've had this on the air before, but not for a long time, from the same book, page 228, by Ladislas Farago. Here in the custody and care were the great captains of defunct German army under the control of General Patton and others, whom Patton always professed to respect, even across the barriers of war. He came to regard them with something akin to admiration and affection as his sympathies for the Germans grew. Now, this is when Dachau was opened up, and Auschwitz, and Bergen-Belsen, and all Treblinka, and the concentration camps. When the horrors of war were opened up, this is the 40th anniversary. It's been protected from most students of high school and colleges in the United States. They saw more in this past 2 weeks than they ever saw in their life, if they watched television at all. When the war was over, Patton admired the generals. He was sympathetic, and his sympathies grew when the war was over. He was working for him now were the erudite Hasso von Montefiore, Manteufel, the ace of the Panzer generals, as was Kurt Student with him, the brilliant and adventurous commanding general of the parachute troops, one who was involved with the betrayal at Arnhem. Here were the former Panzer generals Erich Brandenburger, and some from the Wehrmacht, Gerhard Kurt von Schwerin, Schwerin, and Fritz Kramer, such proven greats among the infantry leaders, and several others whose names you won't remember, but Fritz Kramer and General Patton were together. Now, he admired them. The German intelligence had put their top equestrian, their social buddy, with them to fraternize with our top generals, and Henry Kissinger, according to John Loftus, was in charge of Otto Skorzeny and Klaus Barbie, and I've referred to the marriage of the OSS and the SS, our organization set up by British intelligence and the German SS Gestapo. Here's where it took place. What I think was that the Fritz Kramer that put Henry Kissinger in the Battle of the Bulge, for those of you who are not yet clear about him, and some of you still do not understand it, I think as a fluke, he was picked up on the German side and was taken in this hospitable environment and had to be a defendant, number 33, at the Dachau trials. But according to Mr. KOHL, who wrote the 1,000-page history of the Battle of the Bulge, Fritz Kramer helped write the history of the Battle of the Bulge while he was there, and very nicely left his name out except for one sentence, and I've mentioned that before. Now, in the book on Reinhard Gehlen, The Spy of the Century, I believe it's in Gehlen. No, it's in The Service. Pardon me. It's The Service. It's his own autobiography, Reinhard Gehlen. There's a chronology of his life in Nazi Germany and working for the Nazi Germans, how he was promoted to a colonel and head of the Foreign Armies East and so forth. And I've told you before how he was knighted by the Vatican after the war. The Pope Pius XII admired these Germans as much as George Patton and the American Army did. He was flown to the United States August 26, 1945. I've mentioned that many times. And he stayed there till July 1st, 1946. But on July the 12th, 1946, he was discharged from prisoner status, and the formal birth of the Gehlen organization began. He was discharged. Now, if I was one of the first in the United States ever writing about the Gehlen organization, I was the first linking it to Watergate and Richard Nixon in 1972, the Nazi connections to Richard Nixon. If I was right that Nixon would be out of office because of Watergate, and I don't want to spend an hour listing the stories that I have on the air for the first time or shared with you or published that were absolutely right, I would just bet anything that the prisoner status of Fritz Kramer was taken away as soon as the Dachau trials were over, and that Fritz Kramer sitting in that chair, and you just help me pursue it a little further. Prove me wrong, and I'll give you all my books on Fritz Kramer. Just prove me wrong. So George Patton III is on the board with the late Larry McDonald and John Singlaub and Edward Teller and Admiral Moore. Now, Teller's come into the news. Star Wars, as I say, is the big story. The other big story is the Congress of the United States voting to turn down money to the Contras because of their torture and so forth in South America. John Singlaub and Wackel are into the news more than they ever were, even at the demonstrations in New York, Washington, San Francisco. They're beginning to be identified, these Nazis working with the Waffen-SS. And Western goals is so important that I think you can reevaluate the article I did on why the Korean airline and why Larry McDonald not only had to be killed, but they made a martyr of him just as they did John Birch, who worked for the OSS. So you wouldn't lose the meaning and the symbolism. And I will be using that quotation over and over again, Mr. Kohl's advisor. If one tries to act symbolically, one has to choose the symbols carefully. And that's why the current head of the John Birch Society had to be dunked in the same waters, in the same muddy territory as the person for whom the John Birch Society was named. The OSS worked with the Nazis, and they were very close through the entire war with the SS. Now, I want to go back to the book, The Last Hero. I've also mentioned that on the air before, but some of you haven't heard it. And in terms of BITBURG, I want to go into again about Mr. von Weizsäcker, the importance of the father of the current president of Germany. Just one more time, I want to share with you, in case I didn't do as much of it as I should have done before. This is on the story of Wild Bill Donovan of the OSS, Chapter 45, the FDR's death, that was Franklin Roosevelt, and the German surrender. This is how they surrendered. In March of 45, Mr. Donovan's movements were difficult to track. He was mysterious. He was moving around. We were to open up the Western Front and the Western Allies to occupy Germany before the Red Army got there. And in July and August, the horrible Malmedy massacre and the Battle of the Bulge was in December. In July and August, Donovan held a secret conversation with the German ambassador at the Vatican, Baron Ernest von Weizsäcker, an associate of Canaris, and their conversations involved Pope Pius XII because William Donovan had seen the Pope in July. Now, the Pope was directing this. The Pope, as I say, knighted James Angleton and William Donovan, William Donovan, not Raymond, and was active in the actual decisions of the merging of these forces at the Battle of the Bulge. The conversations, as I say, were arranged by Pius XII, and the Donovan papers show that the regular intelligence officer army who was transferred to the OSS and was stationed in Italy was a Colonel Joseph Rodrigo, whose contacts with Weizsäcker would keep up. Weizsäcker later was to be the defendant in Nuremberg, and his son, the current president of Germany, would represent him. The contact with Weizsäcker would go on through a counselor at the American Embassy, Albert von Kessel, was a person they'd be in touch with. It was to transpire that both Weizsäcker, that's Adolf Hitler's liaison to Pope Pius XII, and Mr. Kessel, from working with the American Embassy, had connections with important members of the German General Staff, including the Chief of General Staff, General Heinz Gurdermann, Gurderian, Gurdian, and Field Marshal von Rundstedt. The same von Rundstedt that I'll go into later from Upper Silesia, running that operation with the present into Katowice, where present Pope worked for I.G. Farben, the von Rundstedt, with Sepp Dietrich and Otto Skorzeny and Hans Ulrich Rodel. Von Rundstedt didn't survive all of this, but the others all did, and symbolically, one of them had to go. The matters were brought up by Weizsäcker and Kessel on the terms of surrendering, intending to permit the Wehrmacht, the German army. They wanted to work on the Eastern Front, which was unacceptable. They wanted them to keep attacking Russia while they met us in the West. The von Weizsäcker contact was still in existence in March 1985. This is a Nuremberg defendant who's going to go on trial for war crimes. He was working with the Americans until the Americans marched up to the Rhine, and when in March was the end of the last German offensive. As a result, the secret war entered its trickiest stage, one in which the OSS, run by William Donovan and Allen Dulles, later on the Warren Commission with John J. McCloy lying about the Nazis and the Kennedy murder, the OSS was required to display their most judicial attitude towards reports from the representatives overseas that the Grand Alliance might be damaged between France and our other allies if they knew that the Pope and Adolf Hitler and von Weizsäcker and Allen Dulles and Mr. Donovan were working all along and working secretly. After several real and false attempts to get an accommodation of Western powers, Great Britain and France and Italy and the others, on January 24th, 1945, that's 1 month after the massacres. They were in December of 1944 when the Belgians and Americans were killed. In January, as the German Panzer Army were withdrawing from the Ardennes, William Donovan of the OSS advised the Joint Chief of Staff that the German ambassador to the Vatican, the father of the current president of Germany, who is setting up this meeting with Helmut Kohl, Baron von Weizsäcker and Mr. Kessel, had informed the British representative that they were prepared to give important information concerning General der Heinz Gurdian with von Rundstedt, and they were prepared to open up the Western Front for Eisenhower's armies. Now, what is wrong with that, you may ask, about this particular action? What is wrong about it was that they were working secretly to make arrangements for these people to be coddled, that Fritz Kramer's mentor, the mentor of Henry Kissinger, would put in the hands of an army private, Fritz Kramer, a salary of $10,000, I think it was annually, I won't say it was a month, maybe he's get $10,000 a year. I'll have to look that up again. Henry Kissinger got a huge home, a car, a chauffeur to be in charge of Klaus Barbie and people like this Otto Skorzeny. Henry Kissinger was around. The problem was that the Nazis, Adolf Hitler and Pope Pius XII, were not very kind to Europe or to the world or to anybody, and were singling out this racial genocide, this horrendous activity in Europe, and that the Waffen-SS, the meeting of the Americans, was at this site at the Battle of the Bulge in a chapter called The Cobra. It tells about William Donovan and his meetings again with Pope Pius XII and their discussions about communism, their meeting with the Holy See. That was chapter 37 of the arrangements at the Remagen Bridge that was not blown up. You've seen it on television, and that part I did have on for you before. I've done it before. But what happened was that as Hitler was meeting in Himmler and their agents with Pius XII, the rat line was being set up by the Vatican for Bormann to leave, and Mengele left later, not on the rat line. He was comfortable in Europe. But Skorzeny and Hans Ulrich Rudel and Sepp Dietrich, they didn't fade away. They made inroads into the American Nazi parties, into the American military. I'll do more of that for you next week. And go on to the story of our ambassador down in the Bahamas that I want to do, our Mr. Lev Dobriansky. I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to do it this week. But the symbolism can't be lost, or the symbolism of Kissinger saying you have to go, Mr. President, Germany, it's important to Germany, or the symbolism of Mr. Rommell, the son of the Desert Fox, saying don't go, and Mr. Strauss saying don't go, and Richard Nixon saying go. Nixon and Kissinger disadvising us, ruining us, Kissinger ruining our country, making it in debt. Germany and Japan are stronger, leading our presidents by the nose, literally by the nose. As I said before when I started the program, Ronald Reagan's the sandwich, Fritz Kramer and Kissinger are the American bread on top, Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of Germany, and Richard von Weizsäcker are the other side, and Richard Nixon is the pickle relish in between, and the President of the United States and every president since World War II has been sandwiched between the choice of American loyalties or from the Waffen-SS, the Gestapo, the Liebsten Dart, the Adolf Hitler machine, the Galen operation that's had us in a bind since World War II. That's what we have to get out of. Meanwhile, my hour is up, so I'll have to continue this with you next week. This is Mae Brussell, and we'll follow the BITBURG and the connecting links to the Nazis in America today. That will be going on for a long time, as I've been doing in the past.